Welcome to Nightmares and Grief, a place to explore and celebrate the darkness. Each episode, I'll read stories written by me, Derek Heisey. So settle in, check under the bed, and pour a drink for the skeletons in your closet. It's time to start. The way I knew I was back was that my music cut out. I didn't have enough signal to keep Spotify going, so I had to switch to the radio. I say had to because there's something about the country there that unsettles in the silence. Thoughts drift, sliding into darker, dangerous places. This place has the highest rate of suicide in the country, and I often wonder if the silence is why. The radio crackled to life with a static blare. I hadn't realized how loud I'd had the music until then. I became acutely aware of a tiny infant panic blossoming in my chest. It was very small, sort of like when you have a moment of questioning whether you turned off the oven. It was the silence. Even with the radio static, it crept into the car, invading my heart with its uneasy stillness. I quickly pressed the seat button on the radio and softened my shoulders when the baritone voice cracked the quiet. Reports in the area are back about a large winged creature with red eyes in Elk Ridge. It's been a while since we heard about this, but I guess he's back. Boy, I don't know what you folks are smoking out there, but you better lay off it if you're seeing a 9-foot-tall bird man. I snorted slightly. So it was back, huh? The big, winged man with red eyes had been coming to Elk Ridge since I was a kid, though I'd never seen it. I didn't know anyone personally who had. John Mills, one of my closest friends from high school, thought it was some kind of cryptid like the Jersey Devil or Congamato. I didn't claim to know what the thing was, but I doubted it was a monster. Elk Ridge had enough on its own without monsters. The drive through town was an unpleasant trip through nostalgia I wasn't ready for. The atmosphere had the brittle tension of a dry autumn leaf. Even though the buildings were fairly well maintained, they bore a dusty aura that made them appear old and tired. Perhaps it really was just dust. Perhaps I simply remembered them cleaner. There was old Dina's Diner, maybe with the same coat of paint it wore the day my dad took me there for graduation dinner. Across the street was the park where I had my first cigarette. A curtain of sadness fell over me as I passed Mr. Gregory's gas station. He'd been shot at the register when Meth Jones and Curtis Gresham tried to rob him. Mr. Gregory's memory was trapped in amber, caught somewhere between the warm smile that wouldn't sell us cigarettes when we had fake IDs at 16 and the man with his hands up, trying to reason with Curtis. My friend, Tammy Byers, had been there that day, shopping for Gatorade to aid her throbbing hangover headache. She told me about it as we shared a cigarette after school the next day. She took a long drag, and it was so quiet between us that only the crackle of the cigarette's ember, like popping candy, occupied the space as she collected herself. Tammy said he didn't beg for his life. She said he spent the entire time trying to convince Curtis that he was better than that. Trying to convince him that it wasn't too late to surrender his mistakes and back away. After she described how Curtis had shot Mr. Gregory, I let her have the rest of the cigarette. That's how this town was. It wasn't the smallest, but it was small enough that we belonged to it. It was small enough that even if we left, we could never really leave. I hooked a right after Salmon's Hardware and looked for the dark blue shutters. They stuck out from the faded off-white siding like a beauty mark. For one reason or another, my father had taken pride in those shutters and did everything to keep them crisp and brilliant. Maybe it was because he never had the money to replace the aged siding or fix the cracked concrete walkway, but could spring for a can of paint in a few hours of painting. While shutters on the houses along the street were worse for wear, flaked or faded paint, dingy slats and hinges, my father kept his shutters in perfect order. That's why I almost missed the house. I'd been so focused on looking for those perfect shutters that I didn't even process the house itself. I slammed on the brakes when I'd almost passed it. The shutters were miserable. How long had I been gone? I maintained the vague awareness that it had been a long time, but how long exactly? I traced the crooked line of the broken shutter with my gaze as I calculated the arithmetic of years. 12 years. I knew my father wasn't doing well, but the sight of splintered pale paint peeling drove the realization in my heart like a stake. My father was not well. My mother had left when I was very young, so aside from resentments and some bitter heartache that I still carried, I'd never had to experience the loss of a parent. You can't really lose what you've never had. Or perhaps it's a different kind of loss. But regardless, the sudden internalization of my father's mortality rippled through my body as a shiver down my spine. My dad wasn't well. I pulled into the driveway and drew a long breath in. The house fell into an uncanny valley, like a corrupted film superimposed onto my memory. The house was hideous and perfect. I couldn't put my finger on why. Squinting, I studied it, searching. Was it the faded siding? The peeling shingles like loose scabs? The house seemed to sag, like it carried extra weight on its shoulders, a burdensome truth residing within its walls. As I approached the door, a chilly breeze snapped across the lawn. I shook it off and raised my hand to knock on the front door when a voice called to me from behind. I turned to address it. It was a little girl riding a bicycle between the lanes of shoveled snow on either side of the sidewalk. She said not to waste my time. She tried to sell the old man who lived in the house Girl Scout cookies, and he just yelled at her. I asked her what her name was. She said it was Kelly Winters, 8 years old, lived in the blue house right over there. She gestured to it with her chin. She was close. I told her that the old man who lived there was my dad, and that I was going to take care of him. She nodded. She said that was good because everyone needs someone to take care of them. I told her that was something to think about and thanked her. It was then that a sound emerged from inside the house. Stifled, panicked, unclear, wordless, incomprehensible. I whirled around to the door and rattled the knob, calling out for my father while banging on the door. Silence answered me. I tried the windows framing the door, then ran around to the back, nearly tripping on a garden rock. I tore through the filthy sliding door and called out for my dad. The damp air hung heavy with the faint stink of mildew and dust. I scoured the living room for him, then checked the downstairs bathroom. Nothing. I called out again and a groan creaked from the kitchen. I raced through the hall and found my father spread on his back on the black and white checkered linoleum. His eyes were closed, and his mouth twisted into a soft grimace. I flung myself to the floor and cradled his head. I asked him if he was okay. I'm fine, he insisted. Just slipped on the stool trying to get a cup. The step stool he'd fallen off of lay on its side in front of the oven. He was likely searching for the cabinet above it where the extra knickknacks used to be stored. The glasses were on the other side of the kitchen. Dad, I said, what glass were you trying to get? Bewilderment knotted his face. Your favorite cup. The Mickey Mouse cup. I knew which cup he was referring to. When I had been a toddler, he'd bought me a little plastic cup with Mickey and Pluto on it, sitting on the couch together. I drank everything out of it and often wouldn't eat unless I had it. I hadn't seen it in decades. Dad continued, I knew you were coming, and I wanted to get your cup ready for you. How long have you been on the floor? His head shook slightly, and his eyes were unfocused as if he were deep inside himself. He didn't answer for a long time, and then he simply said, Oh, not long. I put a hand on his shoulder and kissed his forehead. It's okay, Dad. I said. "Thank you for looking for my cup." The emergency room visit was quicker than I thought it'd be, but we still weren't out until it was dark. My dad was quiet and meek for most of the visit, like a child who'd gotten caught doing something wrong. I wondered how much he really understood what was happening. Maybe he was doing even worse than I thought he was. It was some small miracle that he only sprained his wrist and ankle. When I had seen him on the floor, I thought for sure that his hip would be broken. The doctor bandaged up his arm and put braces on the sprain. She expressed concern about his condition, and I explained that I'd moved back to take care of him. The doctor grimaced and nodded, raised her head as if she wanted to pat my arm, but seemed to think better of it and shoved her hand back into her pocket. She nodded again and thanked me. Most of the drive home was spent in silence between us. Classic rock played on the radio, the only station with any fidelity, and Dad stared out the window. Halfway through the house, I offered a paltry, "How you doing?" The question seemed to startle him, break him out of a reverie. "Oh, I'm fine. Just tired. It's been a big day." "I don't know why you say that. I've just been home all day." I squeezed the steering wheel, wringing it like the neck of a chicken. "Dad, do you know where we just were?" "Sure, we went to Walmart. You wanted to get something, though I don't remember what. Maybe you forgot your toothbrush." I didn't have the energy to fight him. I didn't have the heart to correct him or explain. I was tired, too. He rested his forehead against the window and watched the scenery for the rest of the way home. He fell asleep before we got back to the house. I got Dad inside and into bed without much trouble. He didn't want me to fuss over him, he said, but was glad that I was home. Home. That was such an alien word. It didn't settle well in my heart, especially not in this place. I tried to escape it as soon as I was old enough to make it on my own. I left Montana for college in Washington and then moved to California. I was always trying to get farther and farther away from this place. And now I was back. My father's early onset dementia pulled me back here like a black hole. I raided his liquor cabinet, pouring a few fingers of whiskey into a glass and going out back for a smoke. The sliding door caught on the dirt a few times, so I added cleaning the track to my to-do list. The house needed some work, that was for certain. I sat in the rocking chair, lit up a cigarette, and listened to lo-fi on my phone while I stared out into the night. My dad's house was on the edge of town, overlooking a small wooded area on a range of hills. Elk Ridge was small enough that there weren't many streetlights, and stars painted the night sky in beautiful, messy splatters. I stared up at the sky, eyes tracing the abstract forms, dotting the velvety darkness while sending clouds of smoke into the air. Despite my reluctance to come back, I had to admit that this was nice. I finished the glass of whiskey and was about to head in when the music stopped. I allowed the silence to simmer in my soul momentarily as I watched the sky. But then a dark shape crossed over the stars. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. It must be the liquor, I thought. I could definitely feel it by now. I was a lightweight and barely eaten the whole day, and now, on a mostly empty stomach, the alcohol roiled in my brain like ocean waves. I wasn't even sure what I saw. But then a figure landed on a tree. I knew the tree well. It was a massive thing that my friends and I used to play around when I was growing up, pretending it was the home of a secret elf kingdom or an evil wizard's tower. It was easily 4 stories tall and ancient, and I watched something huge land on its top, grappling the trunk with both its arms and legs. It spread its wings wide and flapped them idly, like it was fidgeting as it watched me. I knew it was watching me because of its bright red eyes. They stared me down, casting a wintry chill across my back and through my blood. Those red eyes searched me, not just my body, assessing me as a threat or as prey, but searching me, determining what made me who I was. A distinct sense of invasion swept over me. I was vulnerable, spiritually naked to this being. It scoured my mind and my soul as easily as one might go through a messy desk in search of a pen, and I think it found what it was looking for. When the creature first locked eyes on me, the primal urge to flee racked my whole body, but when I tried to move, I couldn't. My muscles refused to abide by my wishes. Its mind clawed through my mind while pinning me to the seat. Between my fingers, my cigarette lingered, burning down as I kept eye contact with the thing. I could almost see the things in my mind that it inspected as it held thoughts and memories up to the light of its observation, like a gemologist considering diamonds, but I could only glimpse them. Some things I recognized immediately: childhood fears like being alone in a store and adult anxieties like violent crimes, but other things I couldn't quite place or understand. My father appeared again and again in these visions that the entity scoured through, though I couldn't understand why or how. All I had was the vague sense that he was in some way connected to this creature and that it had tremendous interest in him. The cigarette burned down to the filter and stabbed my knuckle with a lance of heat, but still I couldn't move. In my mind, the entity drew an image of my father in a hospital bed. My heart raced as I understood what I was seeing. His last moments as played out in my dreaded anxiety. Unlike the other images, which had flicked by like a flip book, the entity held this image in my mind's eye, not static, but developing. My father struggled with the IVs in his hand and cursed the doctors. He shouted at people who were not there. He wept for absolutely no reason. The being's red eyes flashed, snapping me out of the reverie and breaking my trance. I immediately let go of the cigarette and stomped it out, the brief diversion of my attention nearly causing me to miss the entity darting away. When I looked back up the tree, it was gone. I wiped my face with quivering hands. The image, lifelike, of my dying father lingered on the retina of my mind's eye, brought forth from the background subconscious panic to the forefront of my mind. I picked up the empty whiskey glass and tried to remember how much I drank. I knew it wasn't much, but part of me wanted to believe I drank too much, because believing that entity was an illusion was far preferable to the alternative that what I just experienced was real. I'd come face to face with the monster of Elk Ridge. My dad had moments of delirium laced between long patches of lucidity. Occasionally, I'd find odd things in odd places, a dinner plate between books on the shelf, Dad's cell phone in the fridge. Once, the toilet jammed and I found my keys in the tank. It was in this way that I found the journal. One night, I opened the freezer for the Tombstone pizza inside. As I reached in, something caught my eye. Nestled between the fish sticks and the ground beef sat a weathered, creased journal. It wasn't anything fancy, just a paperback notebook. I pulled it out along with the pizza, and as the oven preheated, I thumbed through it. It became quickly apparent that it was some sort of diary my father had kept a while ago. As I read, it also occurred to me that this was more than a subtle invasion of privacy, but that didn't stop me. With my father's deteriorating condition, there were parts of him that I'd never know. Parts of him that were lost for eternity, and I hoped that maybe I could indirectly experience some of those parts or find some piece of him that I'd always loved trapped in amber. I couldn't accept this feeble thing that slid dirty dishes between Lovecraft and Chambers as my father, as patient as I might be with him when we spoke. Grief pounded the gates of my heart in a way that no one had prepared me for. No one had warned me of what it would be like to watch my father wither before me, to disintegrate from the strong man I remember loving and fearing to this confused and often frightened husk. So, I read the journal and hoped that I could somehow reclaim a piece of the man he used to be. He was generally terse, so there wasn't much in the journals at first. They seemed more like daily bookkeeping of the day's events, recounting important things, documenting crucial interactions for posterity or later reference. But I flipped ahead and found an entry in shaky handwriting that was different from the others. December 18th, 1996. I can't tell anyone, so I feel I have to write it here. Miranda won't believe me, but I swear it came back. I don't think she believes it came the first time, but it did. Its red eyes, they pierce your soul and see into your darkest corners. It reached into me and saw. It knows a part of me that Miranda will never know or understand. She told me to leave it alone, to stop pressing and to stop obsessing. I think she's tired of me. Tired of my struggle. Tired of my life. I'm tired of it too. Tired of the lies and the secrets. If only she knew. If only Miranda knew what weight I carry. The eyes saw me again tonight. The journal entry stopped there near the top of the page, but not before a scribble had been scrawled about the blank space occupying the rest of the page. It was a tall, gaunt figure with broad wings and what appeared to be thick, fuzzy antennae on its head. Dark red scribbles stood out from the black loops of ink, tracing crimson circles where the thing's eyes should be. The drawing captured something ethereal, something beyond itself, something I recognized. A pressure built in my head, and a faint, distant ringing pierced my eardrums. I snapped the journal shut. The ringing stopped. The headache stopped. The drawing was the entity I'd imagined the other night. It had to be. But how did my father have a picture of it in his journal? I ran a hand through my hair and heaved a sigh, thinking of his illness. Dementia is hereditary. Was this... No, I shook my head. Out of the question. I know what I saw. I thought to myself, now resolute. I know what I saw. The doctor said walking was good for my dad, so we took a walk after we ate our pizza. It was late enough in the year that it was already dark when we stepped off the doorstep and into the air. It was fresh and crisp like a cold apple. A slight smile on my face, I took a deep breath in. It almost smelled sweet. I said, "Beautiful night," and my dad grunted, bobbed his head, and pulled his beanie lower. He shoved his hands into his pockets and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. It was odd. He pretended like he didn't like these walks, but I know he did. He was always so much more relaxed afterwards, and we always returned with soft smiles on our faces. But Dad refused to admit it. He fought me on the idea to begin with and grouched when the doctor had suggested it. He'd never been a grouchy old man before. He wasn't the gentlest father, but he'd never been grumpy. Now, it seemed, since I'd returned, his demeanor had taken on an intentional persona, as if he wanted to be perceived as a certain kind of person, as a person less favorable than he should be considered. I thought about the journal and wondered if there wasn't a secret inside of it that might reveal why. Or maybe it was just the disease. There was always that. The disease was always a reason. Personality changes, behavior changes, cognition and memory decline. Everything could be traced back to the disease eating his brain. I almost wondered if, on the day he died, he wouldn't disappear completely, having so much of him taken by the illness. I wondered if there wouldn't be anything left. Of course, I knew that wasn't the case. There would be no fading away like Yoda in Star Wars. The light would leave his eyes the same as it would with any other disease, the only visible part of him to disappear, despite having lost so much in the months leading up to that moment. I let go of a quick sigh and forced a big smile. "Ready to go?" I asked. He shrugged and grunted. "I guess." We walked in silence for about a block before I started reminiscing. The silence had overwhelmed me again. Even the crickets seemed to be muted, as if trying not to disturb or be discovered. The moon peered between the fingers of the nearly naked trees and cast a wan glow over us, its light itself seeming to cast a hush over the place. So I started talking about elementary school. It was the first thing that came to my mind, and I figured there was nothing about it that could turn Dad's mood sour, unlike talking about Mom or the doctor's appointment he had later that week. But secretly, a part of me wanted to know if he'd remember, or if he'd make a mistake and misremember something else. I wanted to know how much of him was still there, inside, and I thought checking with my own memories was a good start. So I started talking about the way I learned how to ride my bike, asking him if he remembered that. After a thoughtful silence, he muttered, "Yeah, I remember." As the silence grew, he looked off at the tree line peeking above a few houses in the area, only to look away from me in the shame of not remembering. Then he halted. "No," he muttered, then louder, No, it can't be." He stopped in his tracks, mouth agape and quivering, and shook his head. It was then that I noticed the crickets had stopped chirping. The whole world seemed to have gone quiet. I felt the silence creep into the pores of my skin like an insect looking for a way into a host. Even though I felt something, I couldn't see anything. I looked in the direction my father looked and saw nothing, but something about how he stood and reacted seemed familiar. He seemed frozen, paralyzed. A single tear rolled down his cheek as terror filled his eyes. I grabbed his arms and got in front of him, shaking him gently as I tried to get his attention. He saw beyond me. His mouth flapped and his lips trembled as if he were trying to form words but couldn't find them. I called to him a few times, shaking him a little harder each time and waving my hand in front of his face, but still there were no reactions. Don't, he said. Don't come closer. You promised you'd stay away." Tears flowed freely down his face, and his shoulders shuddered. You promised. I did it. I did what you told me to do. I gave you what you wanted. Now stay away." He raised his voice, and I cast glances around the street self-consciously. "Stop looking at me. Why would you come back when you promised? Stop looking at me. Go away." "Dad," I said sternly. "Dad, snap out of it. Whatever you're seeing isn't real. Come with me." I tried to lead him away by the elbow, but he resisted, his frail body like a statue. His whole body trembled and his eyes grew wider and his mouth flapped meaninglessly, and then, as quickly as it descended, the fit was over. The tension in his body melted away, and he blinked away tears, confusion replacing the terror in his eyes. The shaking stopped almost immediately, like a small engine winding down quickly. He looked around and wiped his face. "What's going on? What happened? Where are we?" "We're on our walk, Dad. You had an episode." I put a hand on his cheek. "Are you okay? Do you remember what happened?" He looked beyond me again for a moment, seeming to search his memory for an answer to my question, but then squeezed his eyes shut and shook his head. No, I don't. He wiped his face again, his palms scratching over his stubble, and swallowed. Let's go home. I want to go home. I'm tired. I nodded, rubbing his back, and told him okay. We took our time returning to the house. More than once, I felt eyes on me, studying me, and I looked back frequently. I didn't see anyone, and I didn't think there was anything there, really. But I couldn't shake the prickling heat of a gaze lingering over my body. Something very bad was about to happen. After that, Dad's episodes seemed to get worse. The misplaced items became more frequent, and his long stretches of lucidity grew shorter and shorter. It didn't take long before he spent most of his time in his bedroom, laid up in bed, staring vacantly at the TV I'd set up for him. I was heartbroken, of course. Almost nothing remained of the man who was once my father. I sat at the bedside of a man I'd never met. I don't think it's something that people who haven't experienced it can completely understand. It's a kind of mourning, like a prolonged grief, a small death every day, forcing you to relive the pain every sunrise and sunset. So I spent more time with the journal. As I went through it, I soon discovered that many of the most mundane entries had been written in a kind of code. So when I wasn't working or taking care of Dad, I was cracking it. As far as I could tell, my dad had seen something when I was just a baby. My mom had been there with him, out on the porch, holding me while I slept, and he saw something fly over the house. At first, he thought it was just an owl, just flying over and hunting, but then it returned the next night when he went to take out the trash, and again when he was bringing in the dog. There was no way it was an owl. It was too big. It was a massive creature, he realized, easily with a wingspan 3 or 4 times the size of any owl he'd seen in the area. But its silhouette reminded him of the great horned owls he'd watched as a child in the Scouts. The long, slender body, the broad, powerful wings, and the horn-like shapes at the top of its head. But what unsettled him were the eyes. The giant owl was a regular around the house and seemed to know when my dad went outside because it would appear more often than not when he was there. However, it would only come when he was alone. My mom never saw the bird. One night he went outside for a cigar. Another thing, I'd never known that my dad ever smoked cigars. It was quite a revelation because he'd reamed me out the first time he'd caught me smoking. But anyway, he'd gone out for a cigar, and he was enjoying the summer air, but he saw the owl perch on the top of the tallest tree, the one that my friends and I would later feature as a prop for our imagination. He watched the owl and started talking to it, not as if he thought it would hear him, but just like he was talking to himself. He talked about the stress of the job and the stress of learning how to navigate raising me. He talked about how he was worried that he wouldn't be a good father. And then the creature opened its red eyes. In his first handful of entries that included it, he wrote of it plainly, but what stuck out about the entry about the eyes was that he switched to the code. That was the night when he started writing many of the entries in code, and all of them featured the entity in some way. But what horrified me was that he didn't just see it outside. One entry detailed how he woke up in the middle of the night to find it towering above him in bed while he lay there completely paralyzed. He wrote with terror about how it stared into his soul and brought him dreadful messages of doom. It started coming to him every night and telling him about a new disaster, large or small. Once, it was about a little girl in town who would be hit by a car. Another time, it told him about a grain elevator in a neighboring farm that would explode, killing 7 and injuring 12. Every prediction came true. In fact, he stopped calling them predictions. He started calling them promises. The creature came to him and made him promises of disaster and catastrophe. It even hinted at the Oklahoma City bombings. After that, he told my mom. He was losing it. He couldn't sleep because he was so terrified that the entity would come. His journal hinted at other writings, other promises like long-winded prophecies that Dad transcribed from the entity's messages. It seemed like telling Mom about that one incident opened up the floodgates for him. He couldn't keep it to himself anymore, and Mom couldn't handle him. He spent an entire entry lamenting the distance that had grown between them. After that one, I needed some time. I started seeing my father as a man who struggled with this problem his entire life, whose battle with mental illness had always haunted him. I wasn't sure what the rest of the journal said. There was too much to decode all at once, but I knew the trajectory of where things were going. Thumbing through, his handwriting deteriorated the way stone is weathered by water and wind. The natural forces of his condition must have ground him down like grain in a millstone. How had I not seen any of this earlier? I rubbed my eyes, sitting up from the desk I'd studied at as a high schooler. I needed sleep. I needed rest. I caught a glimpse of myself in the shiny metal bell of the desk lamp. The image was elongated and distorted, but I could still see the bags under my eyes and the dark, unshaven shadow of my growing beard. My performance at work was slipping, but fortunately, it was all remote, so they couldn't see me at least. Part of me was slightly relieved that I hadn't kept in touch with anyone in Elk Ridge, but the part that shouldered the burden of isolation longed for a hand to help carry the load. Was caring for my father wearing me down? Or was digging into his secrets doing it? I closed the journal and ran a hand over the worn cover. Nothing special, yet an endless black hole. Something so simple carried so much weight in my heart. I reached over and turned off the light. I would deal with it in the morning. I slipped into bed, ready for sleep to overtake me, and I think it did almost immediately. I think it washed over me like being dropped into the ocean, but I felt like I was still awake. The room around me was the same I'd fallen asleep in, but filled with a faint blue glow. It was cold, and though the nights were frosty, this was a different chill. Air plumed from my lips in dense fog clouds, and I quivered beneath the covers. My foggy breath hung like a hangman's fruit and filled the room, catching the blue glow and scattering it across the mist. Then, the figure came. It stood at the foot of my bed. It appeared, not materializing, but not simply popping into existence either. It was almost as if it had always been there, and I only just now noticed its presence. The entity was tall, its twin horns nearly scraping the ceiling, and it was broad enough that it couldn't have fit through the door. It seemed to hum without sound, its presence making the very air vibrate around it. It straightened even taller, taking up more space by stretching the room's height, distorting the walls around me, and then opening its massive wings. They stretched from one side of the room to the other, their tips pressing the walls away with the slightest touch of a feather. It extended its arms as if beckoning for me, but I couldn't move except to shiver against the cold. And then it opened its eyes. The red points shone in the dark room, replacing the blue glow with crimson light. Despite its brightness, the entity became no clearer. It maintained only its dark, inky silhouette, faceless without details. I could feel the eyes move from the foot of my bed, up my legs, over my torso, and across my face until finally landing on my eyes. We locked gazes, and I felt it search again. It was like scouring. There was no rage or frantic energy in the creature's hunt through my mind, but rather a calm and deliberate perusal, like a librarian searching for a misplaced book. Images flashed across my brain. The Mickey Mouse cup, the big tree in the woods, my father's journal. Seemingly random images too. A mangy dog running across a street, a screaming woman, a deep and black pond in a vast cold clearing, a well, and the sound of babies screaming. Then the images stopped, and I was left in the room with the entity towering above me. The eyes seemed to shift, to change size as if narrowing, and then broadened again. Then it disappeared. The fog in the room vanished, the red light disappeared, and the room's temperature stabilized again. It was as if nothing had happened. Except I felt something was amiss still. I still felt as if I were being watched. Some images the entity had implanted in my mind lingered, making me wonder what their meaning or purpose was. It had invaded my mind with such purposeful intention that they had to have some meaning. I did not for a minute believe that the entity did anything by chance or accident. The true sleep overtook me soon, but it didn't afford me any rest. When I awoke the following day, my pillow was damp and my heart was heavy. I was setting things up to cook dinner that day when the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands, abandoned the half-diced onions, and answered it. On the stoop of my childhood home stood John Mills, hands in his pockets, his scoliosis arching his back into an S, and a sheepish grin on his face. "Hey, I heard you were in town." It took me a second before I answered. He and I had been so close in high school, spending almost every Friday night together, but once I left Elk Ridge, I never thought I'd see him again. I let him drift away, not because of anything he did, but because of the shame of holding on to anything from the town. Recovered but still dazed, as if in a dream, I beckoned him inside. He explained that he would have visited sooner, but he just got back from a long-haul trucking trip. I told him no worries, and that he could stay for a little while, but I was concerned that he'd confused my father. I told John a little about Dad's condition, and John nodded, telling me he understood. We made plans to meet the next day, and then I saw him out. Before he left, he asked if I was all right. I smiled and told him that I was tired, but okay. He looked at me uncertainly and offered a soft, sad smile that I remembered from high school. He told me to be careful, and the warning caught me off guard. "Be careful of what?" I asked. "Whatever's keeping you up. I took trucking even though it's bad for my back to get away from this place. I can't imagine coming back has been good for you." I told him I'd be careful. My smile faltered and grew heavy. He patted my shoulder, offered one more sad smile, and then left. I went back to cooking dinner, but something unsettled me. It was as if John knew something. That was ridiculous, though. There was no way he even knew I was in town, much less about the dream I'd had. But I wondered if he knew about my dad. Over dinner, I asked Dad if he remembered John at all. He furrowed his brow and cast a strange look into his tater-tot bake. John Mills?" He seemed deep in thought as he speared a tot and then inspected it. "That's the boy who set off the fireworks by my window on the 4th of July. It almost burned the house down. My dad was furious." He plunged the tot into his mouth and chewed, his eyes getting glassy and distant. I left it at that and didn't push. I was just happy that he was eating. The entity didn't visit me that night, or I didn't have any dreams of it. But still, I thought I sensed a presence. I kept waking up, certain that something lurked in the corner, and I'd fumble for my phone to turn on the flashlight or grope for the lamp. I thought I heard whispering at one point in the night, wordless, sinister, and quiet. I told myself that it was nothing, but it felt like a lie. The next day, I met John for lunch. I had expected it to be a distraction from my problems, maybe catch up by walking down memory lane with John, but I was unsettled. I sensed the same eyes, the same presence as I had in my bedroom the previous night. I felt it throughout the house, could almost detect it moving through the rooms with me. I looked forward to the meeting because I thought a change of scenery might help. However, even as the distance between the house and my car widened, the presence's feeling didn't lessen. In fact, I swear I could detect its scrutiny deepen as I got closer to Dina's diner. It's hard to describe. Perhaps it shifted from a light sense of pressure to a tiny pinprick, like I could detect its ire. It wanted me to stay in the house. It wanted me to stay with my dad, isolated. That much I could feel. But that was ridiculous. I turned right onto the street that Dina's was on and shouted at myself in the car, wordless, frustrated, and feral. That was utterly ridiculous, and I needed to stop. There was no creature. Dad's journal was getting to me. I was tired and stressed, and that was it. And yet, the sensation didn't dissipate as I entered the restaurant. I waited in a corner booth for John, now partially hoping he wouldn't show up. I felt harried and stressed and... "You look terrible." John wore a smile across his narrow face, but his eyes betrayed his concern. A part of me couldn't believe that such a look could span the gulf of nearly 2 decades, or that a friendship could survive such a prolonged death, but here was John, hands in his pockets, expectant and pitying without condescension. There must be something special here, but for the life of me I couldn't summon the exact spark I felt it deserved, only a hollow facsimile. "I'm tired," I said honestly. "I haven't been sleeping." "Why not?" John asked as he sat down. I wasn't expecting a question like that. It seemed intimate, like something a close friend would ask. It occurred to me then that perhaps John never stopped being a close friend to me. A wave of shame overcame me as I realized that I'd left him behind a long, long time ago. I sniffed and hoped he didn't notice, then cleared my throat before saying, I've just been under a lot of stress lately with Dad. Generally, that did it. Once my dementia-ridden father was mentioned, conversations usually got silent and uncomfortable, and I didn't usually bring it up for that reason. But John cocked his head and then nodded in a strange movement I'd never seen someone do before, almost like he was impacted by what I'd said and then waited until processing it before acknowledging that I'd said it. He grimaced and asked, "What's been going on?" I couldn't believe it. On one hand, I couldn't believe his audacity, but on the other, I couldn't believe that he cared. It had been nearly 20 years since I'd hung out with him. Why did he care about me? I fought to hide my skepticism as I said, "It's just been hard." John sighed and slid his hands across the table. His expression turned stern. "What's been going on?" he repeated. And that was enough for me. That was enough to break down the wall I tried to build against my grief. I told him everything. I told him about my dad's accident and how it broke my heart. I told him about the journal I'd found and all the weirdness inside it. I told him about my own experience with the entity and showed him the cigarette burns on my fingers to prove it. He listened with a calm and patient expression, never once betraying any sense of unease or disbelief. John waited until I was finished and then nodded. "I've known something was wrong with this town for years." He scooted forward in the booth and leaned forward. "Something as weird I've never been able to put my finger on it, but I've known it's there. He looked from one side to the other in a conspiratorial glance and then lowered his voice. Have you ever noticed the silence? Shock swept across my skin as the color drained from my face. I thought I'd been the only one who'd ever noticed. I thought the unsettling silence was a weird thing about me, like I wasn't able to sit with myself. But I'd noticed that I didn't have the same problem outside of town. I could sit in the silence for long stretches without even noticing it. It was simply the silence here that was too much. I nodded back to John, but I probably didn't need to. He must have seen the change in my face as easily as I had felt it. He nodded back. Something's wrong with this place, Lenny. Something's deeply wrong. He straightened up and heaved a monumental sigh, breaking his gaze with me to stare off into the distance somewhere. I thought about my dad on the walk, and for a terrified moment I worried that he would see the entity in the middle distance and then lose it. But that didn't happen. He kept himself. Just sat quietly and processed. I was glad that the diner had that classic rock station playing in the background, even if it was soft. The silence crept through the cracks, bleeding into my mind with its hungry black fingers. The pause in the conversation made me uncomfortable. I felt like I needed it to continue to feel safe and level again. At last, John said, I want to help you. I think what's happening to you is connected with whatever's going on in this town, and I want to solve both things. I don't think it was an accident that you came when you did. I think there was a purpose to it. Part of me was relieved to hear someone was on my side, relieved that John didn't immediately discount me as a lunatic, but another part of me felt wary. I did think my appearance was an accident. There was nothing special about it. It was merely random happenstance. I maintained my composure despite the skepticism, wondering what John really wanted. He hunched over his hands again. You said your father has a notebook? Yeah, I replied. It talks about the entity that I'm pretty sure I saw too. A lot of it is in code, though, and I haven't been able to crack it all. He asked if he could see it, so I had him meet me at the house after we finished up at the diner. He thumbed through the pages and scratched the back of his head. It doesn't look like there's much of a code here, he said. I nodded. It's subtle, but it's there. I explained the complicated way Dad had hidden the true message in plain sight. John was skeptical at first, cocking his head in a curious slant, but then his face soon opened up into a bright swath of reverent amazement as he saw the message come through. I felt vindicated. It felt good. It reinforced that I wasn't crazy, that these things were real and actually happening in real life. I thought about that a lot since it started. I thought about the first time I saw Dad have a conversation with someone who wasn't there. I thought about how Dad would remember things that never happened and forget things that had. I thought about how dementia is genetic and how one day the bell would toll for me, too. It was reassuring to have John validate my sanity and confirm that time hadn't come yet. I showed John what parts of the journal I had decoded, and he thumbed through the parts I hadn't. Those pages seemed significantly more neurotic, the handwriting devolving from crisp, clean, and regimented, evenly spaced and tiny to quavering and cramped, as if the letters themselves were terrified of the truths they contained. I wonder if part of me hadn't decoded them for fear of uncovering that unholy truth. John took pictures of about 24 pages and said he'd work on them at home. In the meantime, he said I needed to stay away from the silence. I needed to keep the buzz of sound around me as protection. He was convinced that the silence pulled people into its breast and that the silence was what would destroy me. He had a point. My father lived in silence. He was never one for music or background sound. I wondered if John's theory was actually true. A few days had passed, and I hadn't heard from John. I continued my days as usual, logging in for work, caring for my father, and keeping out of the silence. I wondered, reluctantly, if I had imagined the whole thing. The doubt gnawed at me, but I was too anxious to text John first. Part of me didn't want to hear back that I had the wrong number or that John had no clue what I was talking about. To say that I was stressed is an understatement. I had a hard time focusing on the designs for work, and it showed. My boss sent me an email asking if everything was all right. "I know you're having trouble with your dad," she said. "If you need to take time off, I understand." I considered it. But I also considered that if I took time off, I'd have more time that I'd need to avoid the silence. Work filled the space, gave me focus, kept me out of that void for longer. I could put on my headphones, crank up some crunchy, noisy metal, and escape the silence longer as I zoned out to mindless design work. But I was so tired. At night, I'd taken to using sound generators on my phone to fill the silence with white noise, but still sleep eluded me. I became convinced that the entity shared the space of my bedroom as soon as I turned off the light. It made me feel ridiculous lying in my childhood bed, terrified of monsters in the dark, but it was there. I was certain. It was waiting for the silence. I could sense it in the corner. A crackle of attention fixated on me, its mind fixated on my form in the bed. Sometimes I became convinced that there were faint red lights in the darkness, making me worry that the entity could watch me without betraying its position. It terrified me to think that it was always with me, that it was always watching, and that I could never escape it. That Friday, I was exhausted. I took the day off from work and spent the day with my father in a haze of fatigue. We had breakfast at Nina's and took a walk in the park. Everything seemed so still and peaceful, and the cold, crisp air seemed to rest upon the earth in meditation. It had snowed recently, so the park was blanketed in a sheet of white, interrupted only by the black fingers of naked trees reaching for the gray woolen sky. The silence was punctuated by the crunch, crunch, crunch of our footsteps in the fresh, untouched snow. A deep impulse rose up from my stomach in the form of a question. "Dad," I asked, "is everything all right?" It was a simple question, and one that I, to some degree, asked every day. But in the wait, I leaned into it with my voice. The pregnancy of the pause. I hoped the man who had been my father before would hear the underlying truth of the question. My hope was well received. I heard it in his pause, and then I heard it in his lie. "Yeah, Lenny, everything's swell." I nodded as I sighed, grimacing. I decided to continue the question. "Have you been seeing things, Dad?" I wouldn't look at him as I asked. I only wanted to hold his words, not his form, in this space. After a hesitation, he asked, "What do you mean?" "Things you can't explain. Things that don't make sense." My breath caught in my throat. "Things that shouldn't exist." Crunch, crunch, crunch. The silence grew. He said, "There are so many things that shouldn't exist but do." That's a hard question to answer, but I suppose to be simple I'd say yes. I've seen heaven and hell and all the places in between. I've seen a lot of things I wish I hadn't, and I suppose I'll see even more. There was strength in his voice that I hadn't heard since I'd moved back to Elk Ridge. Conviction. I was impressed and taken aback at this glimpse of the man I'd known many winters ago. It felt like a reverent, sacred opportunity, and I was grateful that I got to hold it, even if its touch was sharp and cold. "I understand," I replied. "I've been seeing something with wings and red eyes." "Have you ever seen that?" My father stopped dead in his tracks. I turned around to see him gaping at me. The strength I'd heard in his voice had evaporated, and the man I saw before me was feeble and frail. He hunched as if he'd received a blow to the gut, and he held his face in his hands, and he wept. He wept and apologized and shook his head and apologized more, but he wouldn't say more about why. I took him home, and he was ready for bed. I decided that I was ready for a nap, too. The weight of the exchange was heavier than I'd expected, probably because of my general exhaustion. I lowered the shades, turned off the light, and slipped into bed. But I was so exhausted, I forgot to put on noise. It wasn't a problem at first. I was so exhausted that my head hit the pillow and I was out. It was like I'd been knocked unconscious, but the silence woke me up. I could hear it, sense it like a presence in the room, like a low-frequency heartbeat vibrating the air, too low for me to hear but powerful enough that I could feel it. It knocked me out of sleep like a sling stone takes a bird out in mid-flight. I jolted up in bed and whirled onto my back. My heart rate escalated into a frantic gallop, threatening to tear out of my chest. A cold sweat dampened my hands and my brow. The silence oppressed me. My heartbeat wouldn't relent, but the familiar sense of paralysis overtook me. I knew what was happening. I knew what was coming. I flung my eyes across the room and saw the digital clock beside the bed. It read 8:17 p.m. Beside the clock, my phone's screen lit up as a call came through. John. I tried to will myself to move, and the silent ringing, the silent buzzing grew louder and more pervasive in the air around my skull. The harder I tried, the more overwhelming the pressure of silence became. I whimpered as slow, steady tears streamed down my cheeks. I couldn't move. The entity was going to come again. The room grew cold. The thing's presence coalesced in the corner of the room beyond my sight. I wanted to turn my head to face it, to see my oppressor and face it down, but I couldn't move. On the bedside table, my phone flashed screens indicating that the call was over. I saw a notification light blink. John must have left a message. I wished he could help me. I wished my father would burst through the room with some inane request, rescuing me from the entity, but no one could help me. No one could help me. I was alone. Red light bathed the room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and an involuntary shiver shook my spinal column. I wept. The entity moved around the room, the light shifting around the objects in my childhood bedroom and approaching the bed while moving around it. As it navigated the room, I could sense the way its stare moved over my body, the way one can detect a fire's heat. It shifted from behind me to my side until slowly the tall, gaunt figure with the red eyes entered my field of vision and stared me down. The entity seemed to grow taller, or perhaps the room became smaller, or perhaps I became smaller. It was hard to tell what was more or less true. Perhaps it was all true and not at once. Perhaps this creature had broken reality as I understood it. Perhaps reality had simply never been what I'd once known. We locked eyes once more, the entity and I, and it once again peered into my soul. I don't know how long we stayed like that, because time ceased to have any definite meaning. I floated through seconds that could have been eons that felt like the blink of an eye.
It's impossible to describe the way time bent, the way it stretched and shrank and twisted, how the images and feelings, individual thoughts in my head seemed to come one by one and all at once. I saw disasters and I witnessed joy. I felt heartbreak and I felt love. Above all, I saw death and felt fear. Out of the rubble of madness, the entity my father had described as an owl delivered to me 2 messages. The first was that it knew my father and that he had made a deal. The second was that a great tragedy would befall Dina's. Fire and blood flashed through my mind. I felt the weight of my father's pact as a chain placed on me by my father's relationship with the entity. But it wouldn't reveal more. It kept the thoughts just out of my reach, just beyond where my mind could comprehend them, and so I was left only with a vague sense of dread that something terrible would happen to me. I thought about the promise it made about Dina's. I was damned with the curse of ambiguity, unable to know the details of anything, but knowing just enough to understand the severity of it. Vague images flashed through my mind, more notions than complete ideas, and I wept more. Then the eyes faded. The room returned to its normal temperature. The spell upon my body was broken. I waited for my heartbeat to return to normal and for the sobs racking my body to subside. I didn't know what was happening to me, but it felt real. Simultaneously, a part of me was sure it was all in my mind. Another part wanted to reconcile the two, to say that it could be both, but that compromise seemed too far for my comprehension to fully grasp. Instead, I merely lay in a puddle of sweat and despair. When at last I had gotten a hold of myself and my composure, I listened to John's message. He told me much the same as the entity had. My father had made a pact with it. It would stay away from my mother and I, but work through him. It would deliver its promises to him until he could no longer process them. In a way, it was as if my father were a radio receiving its messages, transmitting them to whoever would listen. My father kept a journal so that no one had to hear the messages, because when he tried to stop the catastrophes, he only seemed to make them worse. I thought about Dina's diner. I thought about the promise it had made to me. I decided that I would break the cycle. My father couldn't save anyone, but I would.
The only information I had to go off of was that it would happen at Dina's diner. I called John the next day and told him that I was going to stake the place out, and uncertainty seemed to lace his voice. "Are you sure that's a good idea, Lenny? It seems like it wants you to do that." I have to find a way to stop whatever's going to happen. It's the only way I'll be able to sleep at night. If I know something's going to happen, and if I don't do anything about it. But you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what it's going to do, or if it's even going to do anything. What if it's a distraction? Or what if... His voice faltered. I sensed a shift in John's attitude. Or what if what? I asked. He hesitated on the other line, as if mulling over his words carefully. What if it was a dream? You haven't been sleeping, and you've been under a lot of stress. John, where's this coming from? I thought you were with me. I thought you supported me. Another pause. More silence. I do. It's just... The more I read your dad's journal, the more I think he's just a sick man who's been sick for a long, long time. The more I think that maybe it's getting to you, the more I think that maybe we were wrong. This is just a small town that's really messed up. That's all. Now it was my turn to hesitate. I was alone then. John had abandoned me when I needed him to stand by me and see this through. Thanks for being honest, I said at last. I guess I'll talk to you later. I hung up and drove to Dina's. I played the only radio station that faithfully worked, that classic rock station, and watched the people inside the diner. The waitresses and waiters scurried about with such focus, and the patrons hunched over their food or stared intently into the faces of the people across from them. They had no idea that they were at the center of something historic for this town. I could feel it in my bones. Something was going to happen here. Fear and anticipation took hold of my spine and made my hands quake. I had to put the cigarette between my lips for fear that I'd knock out the cherry. I understood enough from what I'd read in my father's journals. These people didn't have a clue. They didn't have the slightest idea of what was going to happen to them, or even that something was going to happen at all. They were blissfully unaware. The couple in the back holding hands didn't know that their lives were going to change. The little kid in the booth eating blueberry pie didn't know that he'd never be the same again. The old man reading the newspaper with his coffee didn't know that his time could come sooner than he thought. Melancholy darkness filled my heart as I watched the crowd, studying them, looking for something that might indicate the imminent danger. There was a knock on my window that made me jump out of my skin. I whirled around to face John, wearing an expression halfway between bemused and disgruntled. I rolled down the window further, and he asked, "Can I hop in?" I nodded, unlocked the door, and he moved around the car. "Mind if I bum a smoke?" he asked. I nodded again and passed one over without looking at him. I kept my eyes focused on the people in the diner, trying to figure out what was happening. "You know, they're gonna say you're crazy," John continued after he lit up the cigarette. He blew a plume of smoke out the window and clicked his tongue. "They're gonna say that old man Earl's boy came back, and it was the insane taking care of the crazy. They'll talk about how he staked out in front of Dina's and just watched people and how it gave everyone the heebie-jeebies." "I don't care," I replied, still studying the people inside. "I know what I saw. I know what happened to me, and I know what happened to my dad. I can stop it." John took a long drag of the cigarette. "Lenny," he began slowly, as if sifting through the words carefully so as not to upset something. "I agreed to help you because I thought you needed a friend. Man comes back to his hometown and basically doesn't know anybody here anymore. I didn't think it'd go this far. You need rest. You need sleep. You need closure on your dad. I do think there's something wrong with this town, but I think it's a material economic thing. The silence is a kind of despair. There's nothing here anymore. You can hear it in the silence." He took another drag of the cigarette as if to give the words an opportunity to settle in my heart. "But that's just a symbolic thing, Lenny. There's no entity out to get you. No one is dropping predictions into your heart. No one's making any promises. There aren't any promises left here anymore, Lenny. Your dad is sick. That's all you've got. You have to accept that." By this time, I'd abandoned my vigilance on the diner and turned to him. The grief tugged at my throat while rage pulled my brow down into a scowl. I idly flicked the cigarette and then brought it back to my lips for a pull. As I exhaled, I said, "I know he's sick, John. The entity made him that way. If I can stop it, maybe I can make him better." John dropped his gaze between his feet. "I don't think you can, Lenny. I think it's over and you have to accept it. It's gonna be so much easier than holding on like this." A shriek, muffled from behind glass, emanated from the diner. Both of us whirled our heads around to see what caused the now growing commotion. Other voices had taken up to join the clamor, and the scene inside the diner had descended into panic. Servers dropped their plates of food and put their hands in the air, backing slowly away from the front door. I pivoted my gaze to meet the place where they looked and saw a skinny young man in disrepair, with the pillowcase in one hand and brandishing a 9mm with the other. Despite his size and disheveled appearance, he was loud. "Don't nobody move!" I heard him shout among the screams. "Stay where you are, unless you're standing. If you're standing, I want you to sit. Sit down and take a seat." He scratched his neck and shook his head violently. It was clear he was nervous, it was clear he was tweaking, and it was clear that he was dangerous. John sensed my intent. He reached out a hand to grab my arm and said, "Don't." I shook my head. "It's why I'm here," I said, flinging off his arm. "I told you, it made me a promise." I opened the car door and slid out, escaping his hand as he clutched for me once again. Over my shoulder, I called, "Call the police!" and saw John reach for his phone before I turned around. I hurried across the parking lot and stood at the diner door. The weight of the moment settled in. I was one action away from stepping into a life-threatening situation. Was this the best move? I glanced back at the car where John was speaking frantically into his phone. I took a deep breath. I could do this. It's why I was given the vision. I opened the door and stepped inside. The jingle of the bell above the door startled the man. He whirled around and cursed, flailing his head again, blinking hard. In his other hand, the pillowcase was full of wallets that he had been collecting. He shook the gun at me and stammered, Who the fuck are you? Who are you?" I raised my hand and bobbed my head gently. "I'm Lenny," I said. "What's your name?" The man shook his head. "My name isn't fucking important. What the fuck are you doing here?" I scanned behind the gunman, looking for someone's gaze to catch, hoping I could convince them to sneak up on him while I distracted him. All eyes seemed aware of my intent and avoided me. I managed to lock gazes with Dina herself, white-haired, wrinkled Dina, withered from the woman I knew in my youth, and though we held silent communion for a painful second, she looked away. I was on my own. The gunman shook his weapon again and screamed, "I said, what the fuck are you doing here?" I gestured toward the counter with my head. "Pie," I said. "I came for some pie." "Well, you picked a hell of a time to get some." Nobody told me an armed robbery was on the agenda. He advanced a few steps. "You think you're funny?" I shook my head. "I'm just at the wrong place at the wrong time, friend." "I'm not your friend," he barked, advancing closer. Rage swarmed his eyes with the glow of fire. "I don't have friends." "We could change that," I said quietly. "I could be your friend." He got close to me and grabbed my shirt collar. He pulled me close to him and shoved the gun against my temple. "I don't need any friends," he said. "I don't need anybody. I do need your fucking wallet, so take it out and put it in the sack." Hand still raised, I slowly moved my left hand down. The movement startled him, and he pressed the gun deeper against my temple. I nodded slowly. "I'm just doing what you wanted me to do," I confirmed. "Relax. Everything's gonna be all right." I pulled out my wallet, and he took a step back to put the sack between the two of us. His eyes focused on my hand as I moved the wallet toward the pillowcase. If I was going to do something, now was the time to do it. While I moved the wallet slowly to the pillowcase, I lunged my right hand toward his forearm, knocking it away. Throughout the diner, a surprised and terrified spattering of gasps and shrieks scattered through the air. I threw the wallet at the gunman's face, then grabbed his wrist with one hand and the barrel of the gun with the other. He fired the gun once into the ceiling, again into the wall behind me, and then with surprising strength he twisted us both around so the gun faced the hostages. I pushed upward with all my strength to point the gun toward the ceiling again, and for a while we held it there. I twisted his wrist, and he squeezed his hand again, firing the gun. A bullet whizzed past my ear, and pain tore through the left side of my head. Wet warmth spilled down my neck, but I clenched my teeth and struggled against him, throwing my weight against him in the hope that he'd fall. He stumbled backwards and fired the gun into the ceiling one more time. Ringing filled my ears and replaced the panic sounds of people around me. I lost my balance. Clutching the gunman's wrist, I stumbled backwards towards the patrons in the diner, and as I fell, he fired again. The bullet hit my shoulder, and the shock of pain made my vision go white as I let go of his hand. I heard him shout something unintelligible, and then I heard him fire the gun again. I hit the floor. He fired again. And again. And again. Screams filled the diner, some cut short at the sound of gunfire like a bird struck midair by a stone. The gunman fired again and again until the gun went click, click, click with the dry fire. Much of the screaming was replaced with weeping, and someone repeated, "Dina, Dina," over and over again. I flipped over onto my stomach without thinking, rolling onto my wound and sending a sharp bolt of pain through my shoulder, immediately realizing that was a mistake. I groaned, and the ringing in my ears intensified. I had the vague sense that the gunman said something to me, and I heard footsteps approach, but then there were sirens and shouts. There was so much weeping that it was hard to keep everything straight. The rest had to be pieced together after the fact, through John's retelling, because I passed out. The police burst into the diner, and one of the patrons screamed at them to shoot the gunman. He told them the gun was empty, but that probably saved the gunman's life. He knew he was cooked. The skinny kid who had been so vicious just a moment ago dropped the 9mm, put his hands behind his head, and sunk to his knees on the floor. The cops swarmed him and took him away. His name was Chase Bowen. There were 14 bullets in the 9mm he brought to the diner. One of them tore through my left ear, another through my right shoulder, and 7 more found their homes in other hostages. 4 people went to the hospital. 3 left the diner in body bags. Dina was among them. She'd run the diner since I was a kid. Everyone in town knew her. Everyone had strong opinions about her pie and her waffle fries, and she knew how everyone took their coffee. Dina's death swept over the town like a shudder on a cold night. When I woke up in the little Elk Ridge urgent care, my first feeling was panic. I didn't know where I was, but I knew I wasn't home, and that meant no one was watching my father. I tried to get out of bed and check out on my own, but the nurse, a girl I had a crush on in middle school, led me back into the room and said I had to get rest. She handed me a note that had been left for me. It was from John. He said he was checking in on my dad and that he'd be back. I had a lot of time to think while I waited for him. Every thought that swarmed my brain was bleak. I thought about the tragedy at the diner and wondered what it would have been like if I hadn't intervened. I wondered if I made things worse. It was easy to see the possibility. Chase Bowen might not have done anything if a wannabe hero hadn't shown up, and it didn't seem like anyone else at the diner was willing to fill that role before I appeared. Maybe he would have just stolen the wallets, emptied the register, been recognized by someone in the diner, and then hunted down by the cops. Or maybe he would have just bought some fentanyl and overdosed in a bathroom somewhere. But that was the thing, wasn't it? That's the rub. I didn't know. I didn't know when I saw him there. I only knew that it was happening, And if something terrible had happened, if even one person had been hurt and I didn't interfere, wouldn't I have felt worse? I didn't know. I'd never know. It wasn't for me to understand. That was maybe the worst part. They discharged me when John came to visit. I suppose discharge isn't the right word. They didn't have the infrastructure to keep me there overnight, but the shoulder wound was nothing they couldn't handle, and the nearest hospital was an hour away. They'd stabilized everyone from the diner tragedy and sent them to the neighboring town for intensive care. One of the deaths had been because they didn't have the supplies they needed. They didn't have the tools. That death, Eleanor Watkins, also weighed heavily on the town's heart. It made Elk Ridge painfully aware of its own limitations. Dad didn't even seem to notice I'd been gone. He was posted up in his recliner, watching a game show network, eyes glazed as he studied the bright, flashing lights and bathed in the candy-coated sounds. I said hi as I walked behind him, pausing to kiss his head, and he jumped a little, like I'd startled him. But then he smiled with a soft grunt and leaned his head into my arm. He reached up and patted my good shoulder. "It's good to see you, Frank," he said. "Dad, it's me, Lenny." "Lenny? I haven't seen him in a while. He moved to Washington. He's gonna do big things, but he'll probably forget about me." I buried my face in his hair and kissed his head again. "I'm right here, Dad. Lenny is right here." He scratched his cheek and stammered a little. At last he said, Oh, well, that's nice. Could you get me a glass of water?" I patted his head. "Sure thing, Dad. Coming right up." I went into the kitchen and thought about my Mickey Mouse cup as I poured Dad a glass of water. I thought about the man I'd lost and how little of him I actually knew. I thought about the man in the journal and how different they were, and I thought about the secrets he kept from me. I wondered what else waited for me inside the journal. I watched TV with Dad for a couple of hours. We talked about the contestants and made jokes about the game, but he would frequently forget who I was. I didn't press it anymore. I became whoever he called me, answering to Frank, Dean, and Marty before he started falling asleep in his chair. I waited until the game we were watching was over and then coaxed him upstairs into bed. By the time we got into his bedroom, he was softly crying. "Dad, what's wrong?" I asked. "I miss her. I miss her so much." "Who do you miss?" "Miranda," he babbled. It's been so long since I've seen her. It's hard to raise a boy by yourself, and I wish she could have been here to see him grow up like he has. He reminds me of her every day." A fist-sized lump caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought I would cry too. I couldn't decide which impacted me more. The grief he felt in that moment at losing my mother, despite how long it had been, or the pride I heard in his voice when he spoke of me. I thought it was heartbreaking that I'd never heard these sentiments before he lost his mind. I wondered if the feelings of pride, and the feelings for my mother, for that matter, were long-standing, or if they just existed in pockets of memory that bubbled to the surface. Memory is such a strange thing. It's not just about recalling events, like replaying a movie in your mind, but it's about the full emotional experience, too. Emotions themselves are memories. They're memories trapped in stasis, trapped in resin, to be felt again and again. Even without context, I realized, emotions can burble to the surface as memories and confuse us in the moment. Why do I feel angry right now? Because of the memory. It's because of the past. Even though he had no purchase on the rain-slick cliff of his mind, my father lived in the past. I asked the question that I had never dared to ask in decades. I figured that, worst case, he'd forget I'd posed the question at all. "Dad, why did Mom leave us?" He stared into the distance, far away, deep inside himself, and flapped his mouth in tiny movements. Who? Miranda, I said. Why did Miranda leave you and your son? Tears filled his eyes. A single drop streaked down one cheek, and then another, and then his whole face was wet. I wrote it down. I wrote it down because I forgot it's in the freezer, locked away so it can't come out again. I don't want to remember. I want to forget. Take it away. Take it away from me. I held him and let him cry into my chest until he fell asleep. Carefully, I removed myself from the bed and tiptoed out of the bedroom. I returned to my room and opened the journal at my desk. The same desk I'd done math homework and English papers at for years. There, in the corner, lingered the graffiti scar I'd idly carved into the wood. Heather. I'd forgotten about it. I'd honestly forgotten about Heather. For 3 months in middle school, I was madly in love with her. She had black hair and thin wrists and seemed mysteriously wraith-like. I had been fascinated by her. My heart caught in my chest whenever she entered my gaze or occupied my thoughts at home. But then, one day, the emotions dropped out. I looked at Heather and felt nothing. I didn't even notice when I stopped thinking about her. Running my thumb over the carving, I realized I was frowning. No matter. Time to set to work. I opened my father's journal, which had developed new creases in the front cover and spine since I discovered it in the freezer, and thumbed through it. Which of these pages contained the secret of my mother? My father said it was here, in what I believed to be a rare moment of lucidity, however muddled it might have been. I flicked the pages like a flip book and wondered. I had shown John how to decode the book, and he'd taken pages. But he never got back to me about all of it. It had been nearly a week. I obviously couldn't expect him to dive into the work with the same devotion as me, but I had understood that he was more enthusiastic than that. I wondered. I opened the notebook to the pages that I had given him and set to work. The first entry wasn't much of anything. More talk about the entity, more promises, more of the same, but about halfway through, I discovered a confession. Miranda had enough, my father wrote. My father was interfering with the lives of other townspeople and causing a ruckus. People thought he was a drunk. She begged him to get help, to stop whatever it was, but he kept insisting that the red-eyed monster wanted him to help. It was driving him mad. But it was driving her mad, too. She couldn't take the long nights where he'd stay up late and write down coded messages he claimed the being had given him, trying to decipher meaning from its new promises. She was tired of his babbling, of his gloominess hanging over the household like a cloud, and how his insanity prevented him from helping out with me as a baby. So, she left. She didn't have family in Montana, so my father had no idea where she went. But she left me with a man who she thought was unfit to be a husband and who had demonstrated that he couldn't be a father. What happened next? I pored over the journal looking for answers. I only found glimpses of it, a furtive mention of a promise my father made towards the end of the coded entries, a debt to be repaid in time. And then the coded entries stopped. They returned to normal. To standard entries about his day, the weather, things he'd done, and people he'd spoken with. Seems that after this promise, whatever it was, that my father's life returned to normal. He became whole again. I wondered if dementia could strike so early, and if it could wax and wane like the moon. Cursory research turned up nothing. If I was a baby, my father would have been in his mid-30s at the time. There was such a thing as young onset dementia, but it didn't fit. I leaned over the notebook and stared at the ink scrawled over the page, massaging my forehead. I realized that birds were chirping outside. I hadn't slept the entire night. Part of me felt it was a minor blessing. When I slept, I saw the entity. Not every time, but those encounters, the cold room, the paralysis, were enough to make me apprehensive about closing my eyes and letting unconsciousness take over me. Though I was exhausted, I had enough about me to wonder if I hadn't made all of this up. I wondered if the young onset dementia had impacted me. I was about the same age as my father in the journal entries. I was experiencing similar symptoms. But then I thought about Dina's. I thought about the impact I'd had on the event. I thought about how the entity had promised me that something would happen there, and something did. I thought about what I'd just read and wondered if John had read it too. I wondered if he knew what I knew and had just chosen not to tell me. I couldn't decide if that meant he cared about me or if that meant he was stringing me along. I looked out the window. Despite the burgeoning morning light, I would sleep. I knew I needed it. My mind was too heavy with things I did not understand. I didn't even take off my clothes when I slipped into bed. Sleep overtook me almost as soon as my head hit the pillow and pulled me into nightmare. In a blink, the room changed. The light in the world outside was gone, replaced by an inky darkness. Red light painted the walls and frost crystallized the air. My breath ascended in tiny gray plumes. It came. I felt it the way one detects a fire's heat. I sensed its presence as a chill deeper than what surrounded me in the air. I knew it was close and that it watched me. I didn't want to turn to it. I didn't want to face it, but it was growing impatient. It didn't want to wait for me to look at it anymore, so it clawed into my mind, found the parts of my brain that operated my body, and forced me to move. It turned me onto my back, opened my eyes, and told me to look. At the foot of my bed, it stood taller than hope and blacker than despair, its thin body punctuated by two red eyes. They stared into me and felt familiar, and even though I knew I'd done this before, it felt different. It felt like an old invasion, a recurring disaster, like a childhood nightmare brought back in middle age. Perhaps that's precisely what it was. It told me my father had made a pact. It told me the pact had to do with me. It told me it was time to collect. It gave me a vision of myself 30 years later, the same age as my father. I put a dirty dinner plate between books on the shelf. I dropped my car keys into the toilet tank. I slipped a notebook into the freezer. I felt my mind melting, felt the acid burn of dementia eat away holes in my gray matter, felt the world fade as it made less and less sense. I spent a decade in that space, alone, losing my mind, confusion overwhelming my existence. I would look at common household objects and not recognize them, but feel the echo of their purpose, shape, name, and form in the recesses of my mind. No, not in the recesses. They were missing pieces. There were parts that didn't work anymore, connections that weren't made, things that didn't make sense because they were filled with holes like moths had torn through them. And then I died. My death returned me to the cold room of my childhood, under the black shadow of the entity at the foot of my bed, surrounded by walls bathed in the bloody light of its eyes. And then I understood. I understood why the entity had left my father alone 30 years ago. He had traded my life for his, buying time. And then, rather than looking for solutions to his bargain, he had simply forgotten. First, perhaps because he didn't want to remember, and then, perhaps because he didn't believe it was true. And then, he simply forgot. It became a memory that haunted him, drove a wedge between the two of us, kept me hungry for his affection, kept him distant from me. I wondered for a moment if the true source of his addled mind was the guilt eating away at the matter, but I knew that wasn't true. It was the entity. The entity fed on him, and now it would feed on me. With that realization, as if in reward, the entity's hold on me loosened, though it didn't break entirely. Its hooks still buried deep into my mind, and if I moved too quickly or thought too fast, I could feel them twist in the valleys of my brain. I was on a track. I would be guided in the direction that it wanted me to go, and it felt like the build-up on a roller coaster when the car pulls up the slope before dropping it down the hill. The anticipation of potential energy and the weight of dread. The entity was a part of me now, a forever parasite that would consume me. It transmitted these truths to me through automatic knowing, not through telepathy of words and syllables, simple knowing. I understood these things as well as I understood that I had fingers on my hand and hair on my head. It was perhaps the weight of that certainty which caused me to crack. Although I couldn't move, I started to weep. It gave me a new promise. A simple one, a horrifying vision. A little girl was riding her bike down Main Street. She was apt at maneuvering around piles of snow and slick patches, safe with her precautions, taking care. She did everything she was supposed to do. But a boy called to her from across the street. She looked at him, distracted, and waved. Her bike hit a rock in the lane. It wasn't a bad spill. The front tire spun to the side and she fell, and a lesser girl would have started to cry right away, but not Kelly. Kelly was tough. She was dazed, but she started getting up right away. She wasn't fast enough to escape the car. It crushed her arm first, and she opened her mouth to cry out, but the car's grill collided with her face and sent her flying back down into the asphalt. Her skull cracked against the wet black road just in time for the front driver tire to pop it like a burst melon. The car swerved with the change in resistance beneath the tire, leaving spatters of red in the snow and around the curb and a dark red tread mark cutting through the slush, shining in the dull winter sun. There was little left of Kelly's head after the accident. Most of it was caught between the treads of the tire. Her lower abdomen was similarly crushed. Her hips and upper thighs ground into the asphalt like paste. The car skidded to a halt. It hesitated. There was a thud and a click as gears shifted, taillights flashing white. Then another hesitation. The door opened, and I stepped out. I stared at what I had done, covering my mouth with a hand, and then, after wiping my face, went back in the car. The taillights turned red again as the gears shifted, and I watched as I drove away, speeding down the street. The entity kept me with Kelly as her blood cooled in the frigid air, coagulating in the snowbank, hardening to ice around what remained of her broken body. One voice took up a scream, then another rose into a wail. The entity kept me on that spot, watching Kelly's unrecognizable corpse until the paramedics came. I lingered too long and studied the blood-spattered constellation too thoroughly. The scene was a part of me now. How could I stop it? The entity released me,
and I emerged to consciousness as if I had awoken from a dream. When I arrived in the room, it was in its normal state. The morning light poured through the window. No plumes of gray air escaped my lips, and no haunting entity stood at the foot of my bed. Indeed, there was a part of me that still wondered if I had just woken from a bad dream and nothing more. I'd been under so much stress lately, burdened with emotions about my father. How could I be blamed if I had a bad dream? But I thought about Dina's diner and the promise the creature had made to me about it. Could I really risk ignoring it? Was that even possible? For the next few days, I stayed indoors. I didn't even go out for the mail, worried that leaving the sanctuary of the blue-shuttered house would trigger a string of events that would spell Kelly's doom. I worked from my childhood desk, filling out forms and sending emails without even changing out of my pajamas. I thought that if I could anchor myself to the place, then that little girl would stay safe. Despair fell upon me when I used the last scraps of food in the refrigerator to scrounge together a meal for my father and me. The next day, I was about to have food delivered, but it was too expensive to justify. I clenched my jaw and heaved a sigh. I could do this. The vision took place in a car, I reasoned, so I could walk to the grocery store. I bought enough to hold us over for the rest of the week. I would figure out what to do on Sunday. I didn't get to wait until Sunday. I called Dad in for lunch on Friday afternoon, and he shambled in a little slower than usual. He reached out for the wall and held it, steadying himself. "Dad," I asked, "are you okay?" He raised his eyes to me, confused and frustrated. Half of his mouth pulled into a grimace. The other half drooped loosely. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to remember the acronym FAST, FAST, face, arms. Dad, hold up your arms. Urgency crept into my voice, and I think he probably heard it because his confusion grew deeper on the left side of his face, only heightening the difference between the drooping side. He babbled and tried to speak, but it was incoherent and slurred. S was for speech. It was a stroke. I grabbed his hand and pulled him towards the car. There were no ambulances in Elk Ridge. It would have to come all the way from the neighboring town. "Dad, we have to go. We have to go right now." I slipped on a pair of Crocs by the door, briefly grateful that I was wearing sweatpants today, and urged my father to keep up behind me. He stumbled as he stepped over the threshold, but I caught him and steadied him, realizing that I had to slow down if I was going to get him to urgent care in one piece. I buckled him into the car and slid in on the other side. As I winced against the seatbelt dragging across my still tender wound, I realized that my hands were shaking uncontrollably. This was it, I realized. It was going to happen. It really was inevitable. I gulped, preparing myself, wondering if perhaps the entity had given me the gift of sight to prepare me. Perhaps it hadn't been a curse at all. Perhaps it had been a blessing. I didn't believe the thought, and it didn't help my nerves. As I backed the car up, I told my father that something very bad was going to happen, but I promised to take care of him. I promised him that I would get him to the hospital and that they would help him. I got the car onto the road, and I drove like hell. I swerved around people, driving the speed limit to rocket out of the subdivision into the main street. A wave of nostalgia hit me like a gust of foul wind, and I grit my teeth, keeping my eyes away from the shoulder. I couldn't bear to see her before it happened. I couldn't bear to know when it would take place. I would accept it when it happened and not a second before. The entity's hooks dug deeper into my brain. Loud ringing filled my ears. The edges of my vision went black. I was vaguely aware of tears rolling down my cheeks. The roller coaster sense of anticipation heightened as I felt myself reach the peak of the hill. I momentarily lost control of the car, like hitting an ice patch, sliding into the center of the road.
I slammed on the brakes, sending the car into a brief tailspin as it screeched to a stop, and I felt like I was watching everything happen from a distance, and it was familiar. I backed up as if to get out of the car, my hands still quaking, my whole body quaking, and reached for my seatbelt. As I undid the latch, I looked at my father in the passenger seat. I saw the struggle in his eyes. There was no time. I'd made him a promise. I kicked the car into gear again and sped away, thinking bitterly that at least some of the entity's promise had been broken. I hadn't gotten out of the car to see what I had wrought. But when I arrived at the hospital the next town over, I couldn't help but notice the red splatters flecked across the dent in my Fiesta's grille. I pushed it out of my mind as I opened the passenger door and guided my father into the building. The nurses took him away, and as he crossed the threshold of the double doors, my father cast a forlorn look at me over his shoulder. The doors swallowed him, and I took a seat. It was hours before I heard from anyone. I didn't complain. I was too anxious. I didn't even have the capacity to distract myself on my phone. I hunched over my knees, staring at the junction between patterns on the linoleum floor, letting my mind drift to the events on the drive here. The sound replayed again and again in my mind. The sound of a human being plowed over by my four-door sedan. The song of a child's life snuffed out. When I was snapped out of my daze, it was because of a gentle hand on my shoulder. A nurse stood above me with 2 police officers flanking her, their arms crossed. "Sir," she said, "these officers would like to talk to you." I hung my head between my knees. Tears welled up behind my eyes.
"Is that Fiesta outside yours?"
They found me fast. I guess that's what happens when you commit a major crime in the middle of the day in a small town like Elk Ridge. I ran my fingers through my hair. The tears made small tapping sounds as they hit the linoleum. My breath came in fast, shallow pumps, and one of the cops clicked his tongue. They knew it was me. The whole town knew it was me. "Can I wait until my dad gets out?" I asked, raising my eyes to meet them. "He had a stroke, and I'm really worried about him." The 2 officers exchanged a glance, and one, I'm assuming it was the one who clicked his tongue, shook his head. He said it was best if I came with them now. I dropped my head again. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the tears pushed through anyway. My shoulders hitched to the rhythm of my sob. "Please let me stay. Please let me check on my dad. He's the whole reason I'm here." The other officers said that they didn't want to arrest me, but they had enough that they could if they had to. I didn't budge. "I need to know that he's okay. I need to know that my dad's okay." The officers then turned their gaze to the nurse, who'd lingered through the entire exchange. Suddenly self-conscious of their attention, she flinched and said that she could check. "After the surgery. I need to know that he gets out okay. I'll go with you after the surgery." Why hadn't the entity given me a promise about that? If I was going to hit a little girl one way or another, why hadn't it kept me unaware of that and given me the reassurance that my father would be okay after I dropped him off and was taken away? Why couldn't I have been given an iota of peace? I thought about the energy of the thing. I thought about the terror in its presence, the effect of its overpowering menace. It was not an entity of peace. Its promises did not bring comfort or serenity. It heralded disaster for its own sake. Or, perhaps worse, it did so simply as a product of its existence. No mercy, no malice, the promises a mere byproduct of its everyday existence. I thought about my father's dementia, how the disease had literally eaten away at his brain, and knew then that the entity was a parasite. The visions were a byproduct of its feast on my father's brain. Nothing more. It had eaten all that it could from him. Now it moved on to me.
That was the real secret behind the pact he'd made with the thing. He'd made a deal with the devil that acknowledged his existence as little more than food. There was no deal to be had. While I was in holding, my father died. He had a second stroke that killed him. I heard from John with my one phone call. News travels fast in a small town. I pled guilty. I didn't even try. I didn't have the fight in me. I wanted to shrink into non-existence. I wanted to evaporate. I didn't even have enough energy to sustain guilt. I merely lay on the bench, gazing at nothing, trapped in a paralyzing numbness of shock. One night, while I was in holding, the entity came to me and showed me the day of sentencing. It was foregone. I was doomed from the start. Anyway, I probably deserve it. I'm sure I deserve it. Even good people can do bad things. So I'll rot away, haunted by an entity I don't understand, but who understands me intimately. It'll consume my brain until I've forgotten all the pain, and I'm nothing more than a husk of a man. Here's to the future, or at least what's left of it.
Thank you for sharing my nightmares and helping me carry the grief. If you enjoy the show, please share your favorite nightmare with a friend or family member. Don't forget to leave a rating. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you'd like to go the extra mile, you can join my Patreon for $3 a month and you can cancel at any time. Or you can buy my book on Amazon. I've put links to both in the description. I'd love to connect with you on Instagram, Facebook, or Threads. Just look for Nightmares and Grief and you'll find me. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Good night.